The mansion's marble hallway echoed with a sound that made everyone freeze. A child screaming like his very life depended on it. 7-year-old Daniel Montgomery pressed himself into the corner of his bedroom, his small body trembling so violently you could see it from across the room. His blue eyes were wide with pure terror, and his pale skin had turned even whiter. 3 nannies stood at a careful distance, their hands raised helplessly in the air. "Please, Daniel," the oldest nanny begged, her voice cracking. "We just need to help you get dressed." But the moment she took one step closer, Daniel's screams grew louder. He grabbed a pillow and threw it with surprising force, then another and another. His fingernails dug into his own arms, leaving angry red marks on his skin. "Don't touch me!" he shrieked, his voice raw and desperate. "Don't come near me!" The head nanny, Mrs. Peterson, stood in the doorway with tears streaming down her face. This was her 6th month trying to care for Daniel, and like the 12 nannies before her, she was about to quit. She couldn't take it anymore. Not the screaming, not the scratching, not the look of absolute horror in that little boy's eyes whenever anyone came close. What those nannies didn't know, what no one in that house knew yet, was that in exactly 48 hours, a woman would walk through those mansion doors who would change everything. A woman who would solve the mystery that dozens of doctors, therapists, and specialists couldn't crack. But to understand how we got here, we need to go back to where it all began. Welcome to Stories where wealth meets humanity, and every moment reveals the unexpected. Subscribe now for more powerful billionaire stories that will move and inspire you. 3 years earlier, the Montgomery family had everything money could buy. Richard Montgomery, one of the richest tech billionaires in California, lived with his wife Catherine and their 4-year-old son Daniel in a mansion that looked like something from a fairy tale. 20 bedrooms, an indoor pool, gardens that stretched as far as you could see. But here's what you need to understand. Having money doesn't protect you from tragedy. It was a Tuesday morning in spring when Catherine Montgomery kissed her son goodbye and headed to a charity event downtown. Daniel had clung to her legs that morning, something he rarely did. "Mommy, don't go," he'd whispered, his little fingers gripping her dress. Catherine had laughed softly and ruffled his blonde hair. "I'll be back before dinner, sweetheart. We'll read 3 stories tonight instead of 2. How does that sound?" Those were the last words she ever spoke to him. The accident happened on the interstate. A truck driver fell asleep at the wheel. Catherine's car was crushed instantly. She died before the ambulance even arrived. When Richard had to tell 4-year-old Daniel that Mommy was never coming home, something inside the little boy broke. Not slowly, not gradually, but all at once, like glass shattering. That night, when Richard tried to hug his grieving son, Daniel screamed and pushed him away with a strength that seemed impossible for such a small child. When the housekeeper tried to help him into his pajamas, he scratched her arm so badly she needed stitches. "It's the grief," the first therapist said. "Give him time." But time didn't help. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months, and Daniel's condition only got worse. He refused to let anyone touch him. Not his father, not the staff, not the doctors who came to examine him. If anyone got within 3 feet, he would have a complete meltdown, screaming, throwing things, sometimes even hurting himself just to make them back away. Can you imagine how terrifying that must have been? For both Daniel and his father, Richard Montgomery, a man who could buy almost anything in the world, couldn't hug his own son. He would stand outside Daniel's bedroom at night, listening to the boy cry himself to sleep, unable to comfort him. It was slowly destroying them both. The doctors had a name for what Daniel had: severe touch aversion with post-traumatic stress disorder. But having a name for it didn't make it any easier to live with. Daniel's world became very small and very lonely. He ate meals by himself. He played by himself. He slept by himself in a room that was supposed to be filled with a mother's goodnight kisses and a father's bedtime stories. The nannies came and went like seasons. Mrs. Chun lasted 2 weeks. Miss Rodriguez made it to 3 months, a record at the time. They were all kind women who genuinely wanted to help, but Daniel's terror was so intense, so overwhelming, that eventually they all gave up. By the time Daniel turned 7, He'd had 18 different nannies. 18 women who'd tried to break through his walls and failed. Richard Montgomery spent millions on specialists. Therapists flew in from Switzerland, from Japan, from every corner of the world. They tried everything: play therapy, art therapy, music therapy, sensory integration therapy. Daniel sat through it all with dead eyes, letting them talk at him but never really connecting. One doctor suggested medication. Richard fired him on the spot. "My son isn't broken," he'd said, his voice shaking with anger and desperation. "He's hurt. There's a difference." But privately, late at night in his study with a glass of whiskey he never drank, Richard wondered if he was wrong. Maybe Daniel was beyond help. Maybe this was just how their lives would be forever, a father and son living in the same house but worlds apart. Little did Richard know, everything was about to change in the most unexpected way possible. The call came on a rainy Monday morning in October. Mrs. Peterson, the current nanny, had finally reached her breaking point. She'd found Richard in his study, her resignation letter already written. "I'm so sorry, Mr. Montgomery," she said, and she genuinely was. "But I can't do this anymore. Daniel threw a toy train at my head yesterday. This morning, he wouldn't let me within 10 feet of him to bring him breakfast. He's gonna hurt himself or someone else, and I just can't watch it anymore." Richard nodded slowly. He looked like he'd aged 10 years in the past 3. His hair had gone gray at the temples. There were permanent dark circles under his eyes. "I understand," he said quietly. "Thank you for trying." After Mrs. Peterson left, Richard did something he rarely did. He admitted he needed help. Real help. He called the best employment agency in California, the one that supposedly never failed to find the right match. "I need someone special," he told the agency director. "A woman named Margaret Shaw. Someone patient. Someone who won't give up on my son." Margaret was quiet for a long moment. "Mr. Montgomery, I've been doing this for 30 years. I've read about your son's case. I'm going to be honest with you. I'm not sure such a person exists." Richard felt his heart sink. "However," Margaret continued, and something in her voice made Richard sit up straighter, "there is one woman. She's unconventional. Not what you'd typically expect. But she has a gift with difficult children. Her references are extraordinary. If anyone can help your son, it's her. Send her," Richard said immediately. "I don't care about unconventional. I just care about my son." "There's one thing you should know," Margaret said carefully. "Her name is Grace Williams. She's a black woman, 53 years old. I mention this only because, well, some families have preferences and I want to be upfront." Richard felt a flash of anger. "Mrs. Shaw, I don't care if she's purple with green polka dots. If she can help Daniel, that's all that matters." Margaret laughed, a real laugh. "I had a feeling you'd say that. I'll send her over tomorrow morning." What happened next still gives me chills. Grace Williams arrived at exactly 9 o'clock the next morning. When Richard opened the door, he had to admit he was surprised. This wasn't the stern, clinical professional he'd expected. Grace was a round woman with warm brown skin and kind eyes that crinkled at the corners. She wore a simple purple cardigan over a floral dress, and she carried a worn brown leather bag that looked like it had traveled the world. But it was her smile that struck Richard most, genuine and peaceful, like she'd never met a problem that worried her. "Mr. Montgomery," she said, her voice soft and musical. "Thank you for inviting me into your home." As Richard led her through the mansion, explaining Daniel's condition, Grace didn't take notes or nod professionally like all the others had. She simply listened with her whole attention, occasionally touching the walls or pausing to look out windows, as if she was getting a feel for the house itself. "The doctors say he has severe touch aversion," Richard explained, his voice heavy with exhaustion. "He won't let anyone within 3 feet. The screaming, the violence, it's getting worse, not better. I'm running out of options, Miss Williams." "Grace," she corrected gently. "And tell me, Mr. Montgomery." "Richard," she smiled. "Richard, tell me about Daniel's mother." Something in Richard's chest cracked open. In 3 years, Not one therapist or nanny had started by asking about Catherine. They'd all focused on symptoms, behaviors, treatments. But Grace wanted to know about the person Daniel had lost. For the next 20 minutes, Richard talked. He told Grace about Catherine's laugh, about how she'd sung to Daniel every night, about the way she'd smelled like vanilla and lavender. He told her things he hadn't spoken aloud since the funeral. Grace listened to every word. When Richard finally fell silent, she reached out, not to touch him, but just to extend her hand in the space between them, and said, "Thank you for trusting me with that. Now may I meet your son? Wait, I need to tell you something crucial before we go upstairs." None of the previous nannies had asked to meet Daniel on their first visit. They'd wanted to review files, discuss strategies, set up treatment plans. But Grace walked toward the stairs like she already knew exactly what she needed to do. Richard felt something he hadn't felt in years. A tiny spark of hope. Daniel's bedroom was on the 3rd floor, at the end of a long hallway. As they approached, Richard could hear the sounds coming from inside. Not screaming this time, but a strange repetitive thumping. "He throws a ball against the wall," Richard explained quietly, "over and over, sometimes for hours." Grace nodded but didn't look concerned. She stopped about 10 feet from the door and turned to Richard. "I'd like to go in alone, if that's all right with you." Every instinct in Richard wanted to say no. To protect his son from another stranger who would ultimately fail and leave them worse off than before. But something about Grace's calm certainty made him step back. "If he gets violent," Richard started. "He won't," Grace said simply. Not like a promise, but like a fact. She knocked softly on the door, 3 gentle taps, and waited. The thumping inside stopped. Richard held his breath. "Daniel." Grace's voice was soft but clear. "My name is Grace. I'm not coming in unless you say I can. I'm just going to sit out here in the hallway for a while, if that's okay with you." Silence. Then, a small voice, rusty from disuse. "Why?" Richard's eyes went wide. Daniel never engaged with the nannies, never asked questions, never showed curiosity. Grace smiled and sat down right there in the hallway, her back against the wall opposite Daniel's door. "Because I have the feeling you and I might become friends, and friends don't barge into each other's rooms without permission." More silence. Richard could almost hear his son thinking. "You can leave now," Daniel said, his voice defensive but not screaming. "All right," Grace said easily. "Would it be okay if I came back tomorrow? Same time, same spot." "I don't care," Daniel said. But Richard could hear something in his son's voice that hadn't been there in 3 years. Curiosity. Grace stood up, brushed off her dress, and walked back to where Richard stood frozen in shock. She smiled at him and said quietly, "Same time tomorrow, then." As they walked back downstairs, Richard had to ask, "That's it? You're just going to sit in the hallway?" "For now," Grace said. "Trust is like a seed, Richard. You can't force it to grow. You can only create the right conditions and wait." Can you imagine what Richard must have been feeling? After 3 years of failure, this woman sits in a hallway for 5 minutes and his son actually talks to her. That night, Richard stood outside Daniel's room like he did every night, listening. But instead of crying, he heard something different. His son's small voice, barely above a whisper, talking to himself. "Grace," Daniel said, testing the name. "Her name is Grace." True to her word, Grace returned the next morning at 9 o'clock. Richard watched as she climbed those stairs, walked to the same spot in the hallway, and knocked 3 times. "Daniel? It's Grace. May I sit out here again?" This time, the answer came quicker. "I guess." Grace settled in, and then she did something that baffled Richard completely. She pulled out a book and started reading aloud. It wasn't a children's book. It was The Secret Garden. And Grace read with the kind of voice that made the story come alive. She did different voices for the characters. She paused at exciting parts. She read like she had all the time in the world and nowhere else she'd rather be. After about 20 minutes, Richard heard Daniel's door crack open. Just an inch. Grace kept reading, not acknowledging the movement at all. By the time she finished the chapter, The door was open about 6 inches, and Richard could see a sliver of his son's face peering out. "To be continued tomorrow," Grace said, closing the book. "If you'd like to hear what happens next?" "Okay," Daniel whispered. This pattern continued for 5 days. Every morning, Grace would sit in the hallway and read. Every day, Daniel's door opened a little wider. By Friday, the door was completely open, and Daniel was sitting just inside his room, actually watching Grace as she read. They hadn't touched. They weren't even in the same room yet. But something was happening, something none of the expensive specialists had been able to achieve. On day 6, Grace arrived with a surprise. Instead of sitting in her usual spot, she sat down in the hallway but about 3 feet closer to Daniel's door. Richard, watching from the end of the hall, tensed. This was it. She was going to push too hard and Daniel would shut down. But Daniel noticed the change and simply stared at Grace for a long moment. Then, slowly, he scooted himself 3 feet forward as well, maintaining their distance. Grace smiled but didn't comment on it. She just opened her book and continued reading. Little did either of them know, this trust they were building would be tested in the most heartbreaking way in exactly 3 days. If you're enjoying this story, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications, so you never miss the next powerful billionaire story. By the end of week 2, Daniel and Grace were in the same room. Not close, still a good 6 feet apart, but together in a way Daniel hadn't been with anyone since his mother died. They didn't just read anymore. They talked. "Why don't you like being touched?" Grace asked one day, her voice gentle and curious, not clinical. Daniel was quiet for so long that Richard, listening from the hallway, thought he wouldn't answer. Then, "Because the last time I hugged someone, she never came back." The words hit Richard like a punch to the gut. In 3 years, Daniel had never explained his fear, never put it into words. But somehow, Grace had created a space safe enough for the truth. "You hugged your mama that morning," Grace said softly. It wasn't a question. Daniel nodded, his eyes filling with tears. "I didn't want her to go. I held on really tight. But she left anyway. And then she didn't come home. And you think that if you don't hold on to anyone else, you won't lose them too," Grace said, understanding flooding her voice. "Everyone leaves," Daniel whispered. "All the nannies leave. Maybe I'm the reason. Maybe I'm bad." Grace's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't move closer. "Oh, sweet boy, you're not bad. Not even a little bit. You're hurting, and hurt people are sometimes scared people, and that's okay." "It doesn't feel okay," Daniel said, so quietly Richard almost couldn't hear. "I know," Grace said, "but here's something true. Your mama didn't leave because you hugged her. She left because she had somewhere to be, and then something very sad and very unfair happened. But that hug you gave her? I bet she carried it with her all day. I bet it was her favorite thing." Daniel looked up at Grace with his red-rimmed eyes. "Really? Really?" Grace said with absolute certainty. "And here's something else true. I'm not going anywhere. Not tomorrow, not next week, not next month. You can't scare me away, Daniel. I promise you that." "Everyone says that," Daniel said bitterly. "Then they leave." Grace nodded slowly. "You're right. They have said that. But I'm different. Want to know why?" Daniel nodded. "Because I understand something about you that they didn't. You're not broken, Daniel Montgomery. You're guarding your heart, and that's actually pretty smart for someone who's been hurt as much as you have. But eventually, not today, not tomorrow, but eventually, you're going to realize that keeping everyone out means keeping all the good stuff out too. The hugs, the comfort, the love. And when you're ready to let that good stuff back in, I'll still be here." What happened in the next 72 hours would test that promise in ways no one could have predicted. It was a Thursday night, 3 weeks after Grace had started, when Daniel got sick. Not just regular sick, really sick. A stomach bug that hit him hard and fast. He was throwing up, feverish, and completely miserable. But here's the nightmare. He still wouldn't let anyone touch him. Richard called Grace at midnight, his voice panicked. "He needs to go to the hospital, but every time I try to get near him, he screams. Grace, I don't know what to do. He's burning up, and I can't even check his temperature. I'll be there in 20 minutes, Grace said, already moving. When Grace arrived, she found Daniel curled up on his bathroom floor, shivering and crying. Richard stood helplessly in the doorway, looking more broken than she'd ever seen him. Grace approached slowly, stopping about 4 feet from Daniel. "Hey, sweetheart," she said softly. "I hear you're feeling pretty terrible." "Go away," Daniel moaned, but there was no energy behind it. "I'd like to help you feel better," Grace said, "but I need you to trust me. Can you do that?" Daniel looked at her with fever-glazed eyes. "If you touch me, you'll leave too." Grace felt her heart crack. "Is that what you think? That touching people makes them disappear?" Daniel nodded miserably. "Oh, honey," Grace said, her voice thick with emotion. "Your mama didn't disappear because you touched her. She disappeared because of something nobody could control. But I'm right here, and I'm real, and I'm not going anywhere. You promise?" Daniel whispered. "I promise," Grace said, "and I never break my promises. Ever." There was a long, long moment where nobody breathed. Then Daniel did something that made both Grace and Richard freeze. He held out his hand. It was shaking. It was sweaty with fever. But it was reaching toward Grace. Reaching for help, for comfort, for connection. Can you imagine how much courage that took? For a 7-year-old who'd been terrified of touch for 3 years to reach out, Grace didn't rush. Slowly, carefully, she extended her own hand and let Daniel make the choice to bridge the final inches between them. When their fingers touched, when Grace's warm, solid hand closed gently around Daniel's small one, the little boy didn't scream. He didn't pull away. Instead, he started crying. Deep, wrenching sobs that he'd been holding in for 3 years. And then he did something even more remarkable. He crawled into Grace's lap. Grace wrapped her arms around him, carefully, gently, giving him every chance to change his mind. But Daniel just burrowed closer, crying into her shoulder like he'd been waiting his whole life for permission to fall apart safely. "I've got you," Grace whispered, rocking him slowly. "I've got you, sweet boy. You're safe. You're so, so safe." Richard sank to the floor, watching his son being held for the first time in 3 years. Tears streamed down his face. After all the money, all the specialists, all the failed attempts, it was this woman, this beautiful soul who'd shown up with nothing but patience and love, who'd finally reached his son. They took Daniel to the hospital that night. He let the doctors examine him because Grace held his hand the whole time. He was severely dehydrated and needed 4 fluids, but he was going to be okay. More importantly, something in him had been healed. Not fixed, not solved, but healed in the way only genuine connection can heal. As the sun rose that Friday morning, Daniel lay in a hospital bed with his head on Grace's lap, finally sleeping peacefully. Richard sat in a chair next to them, holding his son's hand, something he hadn't been able to do in 3 years. "How did you know?" Richard asked quietly. "How did you know how to reach him when no one else could?" Grace smiled, gently stroking Daniel's hair. "Because I understood something simple: he didn't need fixing. He needed someone to love him exactly as he was, right where he was, until he felt safe enough to take a risk on connection again." "That simple?" Richard asked. "That hard," Grace corrected. "Love is always simple. It's just rarely easy. But it's always, always worth it." Daniel stirred slightly, mumbling in his sleep. Both adults held still, but he didn't wake. He just held tighter to his father's hand and settled deeper into Grace's lap. For the first time in 3 years, the Montgomery family was whole again. Not in the way they'd been before the tragedy. Some things can never be exactly the same. But whole in a new way, with new bonds and new trust and someone new to love. But this is only the beginning of their story. Because what happened next, in the days and weeks that followed, would transform not just Daniel but everyone in that mansion. What happened next would prove that sometimes, the right person at the right time can create miracles. The morning after the hospital, something miraculous happened. Daniel woke up and asked for a hug. Richard was making coffee in the kitchen when he heard small footsteps padding down the stairs. He turned around and froze. There was Daniel, still in his pajamas, his hair sticking up in every direction, standing in the doorway. "Dad," Daniel said, his voice small and uncertain. Richard's hand shook so badly he had to put down his coffee mug. "Yes, buddy? Can I have a hug?" "What happened next still makes me cry every time I think about it." Richard dropped to his knees right there on the kitchen floor. He opened his arms wide but didn't move forward. He let Daniel come to him. And Daniel did. He walked straight into his father's arms and wrapped his small hands around Richard's neck. Richard held his son like he was made of glass and gold and every precious thing in the world. They stayed like that for 5 whole minutes, both of them crying, both of them healing. "I missed you so much," Richard whispered into Daniel's hair. "I've been right here the whole time, but I missed you so much." "I missed you too, Daddy," Daniel said, using a name he hadn't spoken in 3 years. When Grace arrived an hour later, she found them still in the kitchen. Richard making pancakes while Daniel sat on the counter next to him, their shoulders touching. Such a simple thing. Such an impossible miracle. "Well, good morning," Grace said with a huge smile. Daniel looked at her and grinned. Actually grinned and said, "Grace, Dad's making chocolate chip pancakes." Just like that. As if the world had always been this way. As if he hadn't spent 3 years locked in a prison of his own fear. But wait, I need to tell you something important. Healing isn't a straight line. It's messy and complicated, and what happened next proved that. The first setback came 3 days later. A new housemaid, Maria, started work at the mansion. She was a sweet woman from Mexico who didn't know about Daniel's history. When she saw him playing in the living room, she did what any kind person would do. She reached out to ruffle his hair. Daniel's reaction was instant and terrifying. He screamed and dropped to the floor, covering his head with his arms, shaking violently. Maria jumped back, horrified. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." Grace came running from the kitchen. She knelt down about 2 feet from Daniel, close but not touching, and said calmly, "Daniel, you're safe. Look at me, sweetheart. You're safe." Daniel was hyperventilating, his eyes wild with panic. All the progress they'd made seemed to vanish in an instant. "She's going to leave now," Daniel gasped. "Everyone always leaves when I'm bad." "You're not bad," Grace said firmly. "You got startled, and that's okay. Maria isn't leaving. Your dad isn't leaving. I'm not leaving. We're all right here, and we're all staying." She turned to Maria, who looked close to tears. "Maria, could you please sit down over there on the couch? Don't leave the room. Just sit and breathe normally. Let Daniel see you're not afraid of him." Maria did as Grace asked, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Grace continued talking to Daniel in that calm, steady voice. "Remember what we talked about? How healing isn't a straight road. Sometimes we take 3 steps forward and 1 step back. That's normal. That's okay. You're still doing amazing." Can you imagine how scary that moment was? How easily everything could have fallen apart. Slowly, so slowly, Daniel's breathing returned to normal. He looked up at Maria with scared, embarrassed eyes. "I'm sorry I screamed at you," he whispered. Maria's face softened completely. "Oh, Mijo, you have nothing to be sorry for. I should have asked before touching you. That was my mistake, not yours." And then Maria did something beautiful. She held out her hand, palm up, and left it resting on her knee. An invitation, not a demand. "When you're ready," she said gently. "When you want to, maybe someday you'll give me a high five, but only when you're ready. No rush." Daniel stared at her hand for a long moment. Then he looked at Grace, who nodded encouragingly. Slowly, Daniel stood up. He walked over to Maria, and he placed his small hand on top of hers for just 1 second before pulling back. "There," he said. "We're friends now." Maria's eyes filled with tears. "Yes, we are, Mijo. Best friends." Over the next few weeks, the entire mansion transformed. Grace didn't just take care of Daniel. She taught everyone else how to take care of him too. She showed Richard how to ask permission before hugs. She taught the staff about creating safe spaces. She explained to everyone that Daniel's journey would have good days and hard days, and both were okay. But more than that, Grace brought joy back into a house that had been drowning in sadness for 3 years. She cooked big family dinners where everyone sat together. She played music and danced in the kitchen, encouraging Daniel to join her. She told stories that made everyone laugh until their stomachs hurt. Little did anyone know, Grace was carrying her own heavy story. One evening, after Daniel had gone to bed, Richard found Grace sitting in the garden, looking up at the stars. She had tears on her cheeks. "Grace, what's wrong?" Richard asked, sitting down beside her. She was quiet for a moment, then said, "I had a son once. His name was Marcus. He would have been 32 this year." Richard's breath caught. "Would have been." "He died when he was 7, Grace said softly. "Leukemia. I held him every single day of his treatment. I read to him just like I read to Daniel. And in the end, I was holding him when he took his last breath." "Grace, I'm so sorry," Richard said, his heart breaking for her. "For a long time I was angry," Grace continued. "Angry at God, at the world, at myself for not being able to save him. But then I realized something. Marcus taught me how to love someone through their hardest moments. He taught me that presence matters more than fixing. And now I get to use those lessons to help other children." She looked at Richard with tears shining in her eyes. "Daniel isn't my Marcus. He never will be. But being there for him, helping him heal, it honors my son's memory. It makes the pain mean something." Richard didn't know what to say, so he just sat there with her, two broken people who'd found purpose in helping a third broken person become whole again. 3 months after Grace arrived, something extraordinary happened. It was Daniel's 8th birthday. Richard had wanted to throw a huge party, but Grace suggested something smaller, just family and a few of the staff who Daniel had grown to trust. They gathered in the living room with cake and presents. Daniel sat between Grace and his father, smiling in a way he hadn't smiled in years. When it came time to blow out the candles, Richard said, "Make a wish, buddy." Daniel closed his eyes tight. Everyone expected him to wish for toys or games. But when he opened his eyes, he looked at Grace and said, "I wished that you could stay forever." Grace's eyes filled with tears. "Oh, sweetheart." "Not as a nanny," Daniel interrupted. "As family. I asked Dad and he said I should ask you. Grace, will you stay? Will you be part of our family for real?" Richard nodded, also crying now. "We're asking if you'll consider living here permanently. Not as an employee, as family. This house has been empty for too long. You've filled it with life again." Grace looked at these two people who'd healed her heart even as she'd helped heal theirs. She thought about her empty apartment across town. She thought about Marcus and how proud he'd be of the life she'd built from their shared pain. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I'll stay." Daniel jumped up and hugged her. A real hug, full of joy and trust and love. Richard joined them, and for the first time in 3 years, the Montgomery family felt complete. And that's the truth about healing. It's never just one person saving another. It's people saving each other over and over in big ways and small ways, until everyone emerges on the other side transformed. The billionaire's son who refused to be touched had learned to love again. The father who'd lost hope had found it. And the nanny who'd lost her own child had found a new family to cherish. Sometimes the most unexpected person walks into your life exactly when you need them most. Sometimes healing looks nothing like you imagined. And sometimes the broken pieces fit together in ways that are even more beautiful than the original. If you enjoyed the story, make sure to subscribe and stay tuned for more emotional and powerful billionaire stories coming soon.